The auditorium was buzzing long before Senator John Neely Kennedy stepped onto the stage. Held in the heart of Louisiana, the town hall had attracted everyone from local voters to national correspondents. Kennedy, known for his sharp wit and unfiltered remarks, was expected to deliver a speech on civil liberties, a topic he had championed many times before. But something about the atmosphere felt charged, unusual, like thunderclouds just beyond the edge of a clear sky. Cameras clicked. Students leaned forward. Community leaders whispered in corners. Kennedy, in his trademark navy suit and red tie, approached the podium with his usual confident stride. His prepared remarks were balanced, laced with legal insight and the Southern charm that had made him a rising figure in American politics. But just as he paused for a sip of water, a voice rang out from the audience. "Senator Kennedy, before you continue, may I ask a question?" All heads turned. A man in his early 40s stood up, dressed plainly but with a presence that silenced the room. He held a folder thick with documents and wore the sharp focus of someone who knew he wasn't here to ask for clarity. He was here to challenge. "My name is Clay Maddox," the man continued, voice calm but charged with intention. "I'd like to know, how do you reconcile your public stance on civil liberties with your support for Judge Harlan's 1997 ruling in the Louisiana versus Vinton case?" A hush fell. Kennedy's smile thinned. That case had been buried in public memory, a dry constitutional ruling with little media traction at the time. It had to do with police overreach and property rights, nothing that had caught fire in the headlines. But Maddox wasn't finished. That decision, Maddox went on, set precedent for limiting habeas corpus reviews in state appeals. "Isn't that a contradiction, Senator? Doesn't that betray the very liberties you say you defend?" Kennedy's fingers tightened on the podium. He had faced tough questions before, many of them televised and brutal. But this one was precise, surgical even. It wasn't the accusation that shook him, it was the feeling that Maddox wasn't just here to confront, he was here to dismantle. Before we dive into what happened next, make sure you subscribe to the channel for more gripping true political stories and unexpected moments of courage. Kennedy cleared his throat. "I've always believed in protecting civil liberties," he began, voice measured. "And any decision I supported, but you did support it," Maddox cut in. "Not only that, but you defended it in a 1998 Journal editorial. Your words were, 'The judiciary must not bend to the fickle passions of the moment, even if liberty appears to be the cost.'" Gasps rippled through the room. Kennedy looked stunned, not by the quote, but by the memory of writing it. He had been younger then, immersed in the legal trenches, convinced that structure mattered more than sentiment. That editorial had been intended for scholars, not voters. Maddox didn't relent. "So I ask again, do you still believe that today? That liberty can wait for structure?" Kennedy opened his mouth, then closed it. His silence spoke louder than any answer. He glanced toward the audience, scanning familiar faces now blurred by tension. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't prepared for this. The cameras kept rolling. The senator stood under the spotlight, cornered not by scandal but by history, his own words reborn in a voice that refused to let them die. And just like that, the debate was no longer about policy. It was about memory, contradiction, and whether a man could stand by what he once believed when the world no longer agreed. Kennedy's heart pounded against his ribs like a gavel. He had weathered campaigns, floor debates, even barbed interviews, but nothing had prepared him for Clay Maddox's precision. The man wasn't ranting. He was prosecuting. "I'm not here to smear you, Senator," Maddox said, lowering the folder. "I'm here to ask, when did the man who studied under Dr. Arthur Hall become so comfortable with compromise?" The name hit harder than any quote. A whisper of recognition fluttered through the crowd. Arthur Hall, the legal titan, the scholar, the man who had mentored an entire generation of constitutional thinkers, Kennedy among them. Kennedy straightened, but he didn't answer. Not yet. Maddox pressed forward. "You were his protege." Tulane Law School, 1975. You wrote your thesis on civil restraint and judicial fidelity, but when the time came to act, you chose the institution over the individual. Hall warned about that very seduction, didn't he? The auditorium was no longer just a stage. It was a trial. Kennedy finally spoke, voice low and firm. "You don't know what you're talking about." But the tremor betrayed him. Because Maddox did know. In a heartbeat, Kennedy's mind was back in New Orleans, 1975. He was 24, fresh-faced, fiercely ambitious. The halls of Tulane echoed with debates over Watergate, desegregation, and constitutional integrity. And standing at the front of the class with an unshakable calm was Dr. Arthur Hall. Hall had a presence that stilled noise. He spoke like the law was a living thing, fragile and sacred. He didn't tolerate shortcuts. He didn't need to raise his voice to silence a room. Kennedy had idolized him instantly. In his second semester, Kennedy had found himself nearly expelled. A heated panel debate on judicial elitism spiraled. Kennedy's position, an aggressive defense of hierarchical constitutional review, was accused of being detached, even discriminatory. The faculty was divided. Whispers about his future spread. But Hall intervened, not to shield him, but to confront him. "You don't get to run from the truth," Hall had said, standing alone in the faculty lounge. "You shape it. Or it shapes you." It was Hall who persuaded the panel to let Kennedy rewrite his position as a published defense, not to protect him, but to force him to reckon publicly with his own reasoning. That experience became a cornerstone of Kennedy's legal thinking. Hall didn't believe in mercy without accountability. He believed in reform through confrontation. And now Maddox had unearthed that exact lesson and flung it back at Kennedy in front of the world. "You've drifted," Maddox said, almost with pity. "And when men like you drift, the damage is deeper than a bad vote. It becomes precedent." Kennedy felt the weight of his past press against his spine. Hall's voice wasn't just a memory, it was judgment. In the audience, heads were turning. Some looked sympathetic, others disillusioned. Political rivals had their phones out. Staffers whispered behind palms. The spectacle had shifted from confrontation to dissection. Maddox delivered one more blow. "I'm not asking if you made mistakes. I'm asking if you even remember who taught you why they matter." Kennedy stepped back from the podium, jaw tight. He couldn't afford to show weakness, but neither could he summon an answer. Because the truth was, he did remember. Every word, every silence, every lecture that pulled him back from arrogance into clarity. He remembered, and that's what scared him most. The silence was suffocating. Kennedy stood behind the podium, eyes fixed somewhere beyond the audience, as if seeking a way out that no longer existed. Clay Maddox had withdrawn to his seat, the damage already done. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't accused without aim. He had merely asked the kind of questions that left no easy exits. A young woman near the front tapped frantically at her phone. The exchange was already viral. News networks were dissecting the clip. Kennedy, cornered by former mentor's legacy, read the first headline that would flash across millions of screens within the hour. The senator shifted. The wood beneath his hand was damp with sweat. His voice, usually crisp and deliberate, faltered as he tried to resume his prepared remarks. "Ladies and gentlemen, as I was saying," but it was pointless. The speech didn't matter anymore. Not when the audience sat frozen, not with anticipation, but uncertainty. Behind the stillness, a storm brewed in Kennedy's thoughts. His political instincts screamed at him to fight back, redirect, deflect, strike at Maddox's credibility. He could have dismissed the man as a partisan actor or twisted the facts, but something deeper held him in place. Hall. That name still carried gravity in academic and legal circles. Arthur Hall wasn't just his mentor. He was a moral compass Kennedy had once trusted more than his own. And that trust hadn't faded. It had merely been buried. He could almost hear Hall's voice again. "If you ever find yourself speaking while your conscience goes silent, stop speaking." Kennedy hadn't heard his conscience in a long time. Was that the price of political longevity? Of navigating the tides of public sentiment and institutional expectation? An aide approached the side of the stage, phone in hand, whispering something about optics and trending searches. Kennedy shook his head, barely registering the words. A man in the second row called out, "Senator, Are you going to answer the question or not? Kennedy looked up. The crowd, once docile, was sharpening. It wasn't just Maddox anymore. Doubt was contagious. And when planted in public soil, it grows quickly. He started, voice catching. I'm not perfect. I've made decisions. Some I'd stand by, others I'd do differently, that's the truth. It was a soft answer. Too soft. Too human. Not the kind that wins headlines. Maddox remained seated, watching, unsmiling. He had played his part, now letting the weight of Kennedy's own silence finish the work. Another question came from the back, harsher. Did you ever regret standing by that ruling in '97? Kennedy met the man's eyes. I didn't understand what I was sacrificing then. A murmur. It wasn't an admission of guilt, but it wasn't a defense either. And it left the room dangling in ambiguity, unsure whether to lean in or walk away. Someone laughed bitterly. Someone else clapped once, then stopped. Kennedy inhaled, searching for air in a room that seemed to compress around him. He thought of the Senate floor, of his colleagues, of tomorrow's op-eds. He thought of the trust he'd spent decades building, and how quickly it could dissolve in a single evening. But more than all of that, he thought of Hall's disappointment. Not imagined, real. Because if Hall were here, what would he say? Would he defend the man Kennedy had become? Before the thought could settle, a final question sliced through the tension like a knife. Would Professor Hall defend you today, Senator? Kennedy froze. Every camera lens tightened. Every heartbeat in the room seemed to synchronize. He had no answer. Not yet. And the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was a waiting silence, dense with judgment, hope, and something else. Something just about to begin. He doesn't have to wonder. I'm right here. The voice, though aged and quiet, rang out with a clarity that cut through the silence like a bell at midnight. All heads turned toward the back of the auditorium. A man, stooped yet unmistakably dignified, stepped forward with the assistance of a cane. Dr. Arthur Hall. A gasp rippled through the crowd. For a moment, time held its breath. Kennedy's eyes widened, not in fear but disbelief. The man he hadn't seen in over a decade was walking toward him, slow but unshaken, every stride a defiance of age and expectation. Maddox stiffened. This wasn't part of his design. Hall reached the edge of the stage and turned to face the audience. His skin was grayer now, his frame thinner, but his presence was unshaken. His gaze, steady as ever, swept across the room. You asked if I would defend this man, Hall said, and I will. But first I'll remind you of what it means to defend. The crowd listened. No one interrupted. To defend is not to excuse, he continued. John has made decisions I've disagreed with, some publicly, some in private. But I have watched him struggle with what most men never bother to question, their own certainties. He looked toward Kennedy now. When you were 24, you came to me, not with arrogance, but confusion. You wanted to be right, more than you wanted to be honest. I told you then, the law doesn't need your certainty, it needs your courage. Kennedy's throat tightened. I stood by him then, Hall said, voice firm. Not because he was right, but because he was willing to confront what made him wrong. He turned back to the audience. What Mr. Maddox has done here tonight is not without merit. Challenging power matters. Holding leaders accountable matters. But there is a line between accountability and spectacle. The room was silent. You can dig into a man's past. You can pull his quotes from dusty journals, but unless you also acknowledge the man who got back up and tried to be better, you're not after truth. You're after theater. Maddox flinched, but remained still. Hall went on. Kennedy has changed, not always in ways I would have chosen, but I know this, he carries guilt, not as a shield, but as a compass. And if he's standing here, unwilling to defend himself with rehearsed lines or hollow pride, then perhaps he remembers what I taught him better than I feared. Kennedy lowered his head. A few audience members began to nod. One woman wiped her eye. The tension softened, not completely, but enough to allow breath back into the room. I'm not here to rescue him, Hall said finally. He doesn't need rescuing, he needs reminding. And so do you. With that, he placed a hand gently on Kennedy's shoulder. The senator looked up, eyes glassy, but voice steady. "Thank you, sir." Hall nodded. A man is not his mistakes. He is his ability to face them. There was no applause, not yet, but there was a stillness heavy with meaning. A collective sense that something important had happened, not a defense, not a rebuttal, but a reckoning. And in that reckoning, Kennedy stood taller, not vindicated, not absolved, but seen. The debate ended not with applause, but with reflection. People filed out slowly, whispering, absorbing. Some had come for answers, others for a spectacle. But what they left with was something rare, a glimpse of a man wrestling with his own past, and a mentor reminding the world what it means to grow. By morning, clips of Arthur Hall's quiet entrance had overtaken the internet. Not Kennedy's silence, not Maddox's questions, but Hall's words, firm, unflinching, compassionate, had caught fire. Opinion columns shifted tone. Commentators who had predicted Kennedy's fall paused. The narrative changed, not because he had defended himself, but because he hadn't tried to escape what confronted him. 2 days later, Maddox gave a televised statement. "I stand by my questions," he said, "but I underestimated the power of humility. I came to expose a contradiction." What I saw instead was a man still learning. Kennedy didn't gloat. He didn't retaliate. He returned to work. But something in him had altered, like a door, long jammed by pride, had finally creaked open. He paid a visit to Arthur Hall the following weekend. The old professor's home was quiet, filled with the scent of old wood and dry pages. They sat across from each other, the same way they had in Hall's office 40 years earlier. "You didn't have to come," Hall said, stirring tea with a slight tremor. "I did," Kennedy replied. "I needed to." They talked for hours, not about politics, but about legacy, about the cost of compromise, about the danger of certainty. At one point, Hall stood and walked slowly to a bookshelf. He pulled down a worn volume, the US Constitution annotated, with decades of notes scribbled in the margins. He handed it to Kennedy. "I've carried this through every class, every lecture, every mistake. It's time it went to someone who'll carry it forward." Kennedy took it with both hands, the weight heavier than paper. That following week, the senator introduced new legislation. It wasn't flashy, it wouldn't dominate headlines, but it sought to restore judicial independence in state appellate courts, reversing trends that had emerged from the very rulings Maddox had criticized. He named the bill after Hall. Reporters asked him why. "Because some lessons you don't learn in the chamber," Kennedy said. "You learn them when someone has the courage to stand up, even when you don't deserve it." The bill passed with bipartisan support, quietly, effectively. And though it didn't erase the past, it added something to the record. A man who was willing to change course. Months passed. Hall's health declined. Kennedy visited him often, each time reading passages aloud from that annotated Constitution. And when the professor passed quietly in his sleep, the nation mourned not just a scholar but a standard. Kennedy delivered the eulogy. He ended it simply. "He taught us not to fear being wrong, only to fear staying that way." And as he stepped down from the pulpit, the silence in the room echoed the one they had all felt in that auditorium, heavy, honest, and full of meaning. Thank you for staying with us through this powerful journey of truth, reckoning, and redemption. If this story moved you, subscribe now for more untold political truths and moments of unexpected humanity. And don't forget to click the next video on your screen, a story of a senator who turned a moment of disgrace into a national movement for justice. You won't want to miss it.